A World of Sound by Olaf Stapledon. Written and originally published in a 1936 anthology called Hotch Potch, this is among the author's stories that was largely forgotten for nearly 40 years and is, in a way, a condensed version of his Last and First Men series. It resurfaced in the November 1974 issue of Science Fiction Monthly magazine, which republished it the following year in the Best of Science Fiction Monthly. It next appeared in a 1979 collection of the author's stories, which includes some previously unpublished material entitled Far Future Calling, Uncollected Science Fiction and Fantasies of Olaf Stapledon, for which a new edition was released in 1986 and another in 2015. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Modern Masters of Science Fiction, an introduction by Walter Gillings preceding Science Fiction Monthly's presentation of the story in 1974. To dyed-in-the-wool science fiction fans, not to have read Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men is the unforgivable sin. Yet, to most of today's readers, Stapledon's name conveys little or nothing. Very few anthologies include an extract from his works, which are not always easy to come by. He never wrote for the popular magazines, and anyway, his books were not written as science fiction. He called them fantastic fiction of a semi-philosophical kind. Still, to avid readers of the 1940s and 50s, and to many lesser writers whose names are better known, the works of Olaf Stapledon represent the zenith of imaginative conception, especially those two which together encompass the whole cosmos in a mind-blowing panorama of future history, Last and First Men and Star Maker. On both sides of the Atlantic, these unique fantasies were regarded with veneration, and their author as a master fit to rank with Wells himself, if not to replace him as the new peer of the literature. Nor was this adulation confined to the inveterate readers of science fiction, of whose existence Stapledon remained unaware for several years after his first major work had been acclaimed by the critics. Before then, he had published 2 small volumes of poetry which reflected his early socialist leanings, and the first of several nonfiction works which appeared at intervals between his novels, if they could be described as such. A Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy, William Olaf Stapledon, he discarded his first name, was no scientist, but he was genuinely concerned about the proper use of science for the benefit of the community and with the establishment of a new social order. He spent much time lecturing audiences, large and small, warning against the forces of reaction and censorship, and advocating intelligence and kindliness as workable assets in the movement towards true civilization. If these assets were lost or destroyed, he said, the human species may vanish like the mastodon. Born in Wirral, near Liverpool, in 1886, he had the advantage of a good schooling, went to Oxford, and taught at Manchester Grammar School before working in a shipping office in Port Said, where he had spent part of his childhood. Back in England, he conducted workers' education classes at Liverpool University until the First World War interrupted his career, though he once confessed in a letter, quote, "I really have not had a career, having chopped and changed from one thing to another without finding my feet anywhere." End quote. He called himself a born muddler. After the war, he married an Australian girl and returned to the university at Liverpool, where he received his Ph.D. and continued to lecture in philosophy and psychology. He and his wife sought recreation in walking, swimming, and mountain climbing. They had 2 children, a son and daughter. And it was there, in the late 1920s, that he wrote Last and First Men, a story of the near and far future, which he described in a preface as an essay in myth creation, while denying any attempt at prophecy. Adopting the viewpoint of an inhabitant of a distant epoch, one of the last men, he projected his imaginary history of humankind over no less than 2,000 million years, to the end of recorded time. It detailed the rise and fall of successive civilizations, during which the apes subdue the human species and a Martian invasion provokes interplanetary conflict, ending in man's reversion to savagery. Then a new race arises to be ruled by giant brains and give place to yet another breed of supermen. At length, the fifth men are menaced by the breakup of the moon, compelling them to migrate to Venus after 1,000,000 years preparing for the move. Finally, threatened by the extinction of the sun, the ninth men are specially designed to start the colonization of Neptune, where 9 more species evolve over the next 600 million years before their story ends. Not on a pessimistic note entirely, for the last men, faced with spiritual dissolution, are still intent on scattering the seed of their kind into space to root in some distant galaxy. And if it should perish, as it must eventually, it is very good to have been man. No summary can do justice to the absorbing detail with which, in crystal-clear prose, Stapledon conveyed his amazing conceptions, not only of alien environments and bizarre mutations, but of the psychological and sexual attitudes implicit in the structure of his mythical societies. In this respect, the book was refreshingly different from the bulk of current American science fiction, yet its substance was essentially similar, and its scope as ambitious as anything ever attempted before then. There were, perhaps, faint echoes of the French astronomer Camille Flammarion's classic Omega, The Last Days of the World, in which the last man and woman find refuge on Jupiter before the sun goes out. When Last and First Men hit the literary headlines in 1930, J.B. Priestley pronounced it far and away the best book of this kind in our time, a masterpiece. The following year, it saw publication in the USA, where the noted radio commentator and writer Elmer Davis hailed it as the boldest and most imaginative book of our times. In Amazing Stories, literary editor C.A. Brandt also noted it as worth careful study, a masterpiece in the realm of scientific fiction. By 1932, it had been supplemented here by Last Men in London, in which the author adopted the same remote Neptunian viewpoint to tell what was, in the main, a more down-to-earth story based on his own experiences, especially during the war when he served in France and in the Friends Ambulance Unit, a non-combatant contingent. After the near-limitless vistas of the earlier book, this more introspective narrative seemed like an anticlimax, but to those who persisted it presented a fascinating picture of the life and customs of future man, his science and philosophy, as retailed by the 20,000-year-old explorer of the human past. In the account of his manipulation of the pacifist Paul as he grows from boyhood to maturity, Stapledon subtly revealed his own attitude to every aspect of life, from politics to sex, and at the end, the emergence of a potential superior species, typified by one of Paul's pupils, hints at the story of Odd John, which followed in 1935. Opening this story between jest and earnest, the author did not disguise the fact that it had been inspired by J.D. Beresford's classic account of the Hamptonshire Wonder, which dates back to 1911. Adopting this time a straightforward novel approach, he produced a thoroughly entertaining tale on a theme which has since been developed by many writers. Essentially, however, it reflected the author's constant preoccupation with the true life of the spirit, though even the enlightened mutant himself cannot define precisely what that implies. In Sirius, 1944, Stapledon returned to the superbeing theme, but instead of a boy with extrasensory powers, the prodigy is a dog who retains his canine instincts while growing in mind and spirit, and at length consorting with the girl who raised him. In the view of many critics, this fantasy of love and discord represents Stapledon at his best as a novelist. But for sheer imaginative power and original conception, nothing can compare with his cosmological fantasy, Star Maker, which appeared in 1937. In the author's own words, in a letter written just prior to its publication, Star Maker is, I fear, a much wilder and more remote and philosophical work than Last and First Men. Probably it will be my last fantastic book. And for his publisher's catalog, he wrote his own blurb, which summed up the vast extent of the work in 100 words. Quote, "An imaginary exploration of the cosmos reveals the history of life and mind in our galaxy and throughout the swarm of galaxies. After tracing the fortunes of many non-human intelligent races in remote planetary systems, the story tells of the dire events which preceded the foundation of a utopian society of worlds in our galaxy, of the desperate struggle between this society and another order of intelligence, of the belated emergence of an imperfect and short-lived cosmical mind, of the strange relations between this spatio-temporal cosmos of ours and its ungodly creator, and of his many other creations." End quote. Reviewing Star Maker in Scientific Fiction, John Benon Harris summed it up even more succinctly. Quote, "It is the life story of life." End quote. And to read it is the experience of a lifetime. If Stapledon had written nothing else, he might still have justified his place in science fiction's hierarchy. His approach was that of the philosopher rather than the teller of tales, yet he told an engrossing story in which the hero was no super scientist or conquering spaceman, but the entire species of man. What puzzled his most ardent readers was that he knew nothing of American science fiction until 1936, when the Liverpool writer Eric Frank Russell introduced him to the pulp magazines. His reaction was one of surprise that so much was being done along the lines he had been pursuing quite independently. Though he found some of the ideas they offered very striking and vividly treated, he thought the human side was generally terribly crude, especially the love interest. How did he come by his own wealth of ideas which he treated so differently? He confessed, quote, "The general plan of Last and First Men came in a flash as I was watching seals from the cliffs of Anglesey. Afterwards, I simply pumped all my scientific friends for all the information I needed." He admitted to being influenced by the ideas of Gerald Hurd, the science writer who later moved to California and produced that remarkable novel, Doppelgangers, 1947. He also adapted some of the notions of Professor J.D. Bernal, who in the 1920s envisaged whole societies being transported through space on miniature planets. By the time Star Maker appeared, Stapledon had joined the British Interplanetary Society, but it was not until 1948 that he was persuaded to lecture them on interplanetary man. The occasion gave many of his disciples their only chance to see and hear the smiling, mild-mannered man with graying hair and twinkling blue eyes, who Arthur C. Clarke has described as one of the most civilized men of our time. Repeated attempts by at least one editor to induce Stapledon to write for a science fiction magazine all proved futile, however. His excuse was that his mind did not run along the lines of short stories, but some of his later novels made very slim volumes. Shortest of all is Old Man in New World, 1944, which looked forward to a world state in the 1970s. 2 years earlier, Darkness and the Light suggested the prospect of two alternative futures for mankind, with communism as the dark menace. In Death into Life, 1946, he re-explored the past, present, and future through the ubiquitous spirit of man. More mystical than scientific, this fantasia contained only faint reflections of his first tremendous work. The Flames, 1947, another short novel, relies on the pleasant fancy that sentient life forms native to the sun and stranded on Earth might be revived through atomic fission to become spiritual guides to blundering mankind. A theme by no means new to science fiction, but it did little more than underline the author's previous statements on what he called the tragic disorder of our whole terrestrial hive. His last novel, A Man Divided, 1950, published shortly before his death at the age of 64, is mainly interesting as providing further insight into Stapledon's own personality and the shaping of his philosophy. Though ostensibly the tale of a man of dual personality who is influenced by a woman with psychic powers, it clearly derives from his own varied experience and his efforts to resolve his intellectual conflicts. Even more enlightening is the posthumous work The Opening of the Eyes, which was completed for publication in 1954 by his widow Agnes, who is still active in her 80s. In the words of his lifelong friend, Dr. E.V. Ryu, in a preface to the book, it describes how Stapledon had, quote, reached the goal of his thinking and come to terms with reality, end quote, shortly before he died. His conclusion was that although God might be an illusion, quote, without the fiction of your existence, I am no more than a reflex animal, and the world is dust, end quote. A world of sounds. The room was overcrowded and stuffy. The music seemed to have no intelligible form. It was a mere jungle of noise. Now one instrument and now another blared out half a tune, but every one of these abortive musical creatures was killed before it had found its legs. Some other and hostile beast fell upon it and devoured it, or the whole jungle suffocated it. The strain of following this struggle for existence wearied me. I closed my eyes and must have fallen asleep, for suddenly I woke with a start. Or seemed to wake. Something queer had happened. The music was still going on, but I was paralyzed. I could not open my eyes. I could not shout for help. I could not move my body, nor feel it. I had no body. Something had happened to the music, too, and to my hearing. But what? The tissue of sounds seemed to have become incomparably more voluminous and involved. I am not musical, but suddenly I realized that this music had overflowed, so to speak, into all the intervals between the normal semitones, that it was using not merely quarter tones, but centitones and millitones, with an effect that would surely have been a torture to the normal ear. To me, in my changed state, it gave a sense of richness, solidity, and vitality quite lacking in ordinary music. This queer music, moreover, had another source of wealth. It reached up and down over scores of octaves beyond the range of normal hearing, yet I could hear it. As I listened, I grew surprisingly accustomed to this new jargon. I found myself easily distinguishing all sorts of coherent musical forms in this world of sound. Against an obscure, exotic background of more or less constant chords and fluttering leafage, so to speak, several prominent and ever-changing sound figures were playing. Each was a persistent musical object, though fluctuating in detail of gesture and sometimes ranging bodily up or down the scale. Suddenly I made a discovery which should have been incredible, yet it seemed to me at the time quite familiar and obvious. I found myself recognizing that these active sound figures were alive, even intelligent. In the normal world, living things are perceived as changing patterns of visible and tangible characters. In this mad world, which was coming to seem to me quite homely, patterns not of color and shape, but of sound, formed the perceptible bodies of living things. When it occurred to me that I had fallen into a land of program music, I was momentarily disgusted. Here was a whole world that violated the true canons of musical art. Then I reminded myself that this music was not merely telling, but actually living its story. In fact, it was not art, but life. So I gave rein to my interest. Observing these creatures that disported themselves before me, I discovered, or rather rediscovered, that though this world had no true space, such as we perceive by sight and touch, yet it did have a sort of space. For in some sense these living things were moving in relation to me and in relation to one another. Apparently the space of this world consisted of 2 dimensions only, and these differed completely in quality. One was the obvious dimension of tonality or pitch on the subtle keyboard of this world. The other was perceived only indirectly. It corresponded to the heard nearness or remoteness of one and the same instrument in the normal world. Just as we see things as near and far through the signification of color and perspective, so in this strange world certain characters of timbre, of harmonics, of overtones conveyed a sense of nearness, others a sense of distance. A peculiar blatancy, often combined with loudness, meant near. A certain flatness or ghostliness of timbre, generally combined with faintness, meant far. An object receding in this level dimension, as I called it, would gradually lose its full-bodied timbre and its detail and preciseness. At the same time, it would become fainter and at last inaudible. I should add that each sound object had also its own characteristic timbre, almost as though each thing in this world were a theme played by one and the same instrument. But I soon discovered that in the case of living things, the timbre range of each individual was very wide, for emotional changes might be accompanied by changes of timbre even greater than those which distinguish our instruments. In contrast with the variegated but almost changeless background or landscape, the living things were in constant movement, always preserving their individuality, their basic identity of tonal pattern. They would withdraw or approach in the level dimension or run up and down the scale. They also indulged in ceaseless rippling play of musical gesture. Very often, one of these creatures, traveling up or down the scale, would encounter another. Then either the two would simply interpenetrate and cross one another as transverse trains of waves on a pond, or there would be some sort of mutual readjustment of form, apparently so as to enable them to squeeze past one another without collision. And collision in this world seemed to be much like dissonance in our music. Sometimes, to avoid collision, a creature needed merely to effect a slight alteration in its tonal form, but sometimes it had to move far aside, so to speak, in the other dimension, which I have called the level dimension. Thus, it became for a while inaudible. Another discovery now flashed upon me, again with curious familiarity. I myself had a body in this world. This was the nearest of all the sound objects. It was so near and so obvious that I never noticed it till it was brought into action. This happened unexpectedly. One of the moving creatures inadvertently came into collision with a minor part of my musical body. The slight violation of my substance stabbed me with a little sharp pain. Immediately, by reflex action and then purposefully, I readjusted my musical shape so as to avoid further conflict. Thus it was that I discovered, or rediscovered, the power of voluntary action in this world. I also emitted a loud coruscation of musical gesture, which I at once knew to be significant speech. In fact, I said in the language of that world, "Damn you, that's my toe, that was." There came from the other an answering and apologetic murmur. A newcomer now approached from the silent distance to join my frolicking companions. This being was extremely attractive to me and poignantly familiar. Her lithe figure, her lyrical yet faintly satirical movement, turned the jungle into Arcadia. To my delight, I found that I was not unknown to her and not wholly unpleasing. With a gay gesture, she beckoned me into the game. For the first time, I not only changed the posture of my musical limbs, but moved bodily, both in the dimension of pitch and the level dimension. As soon as I approached, she slipped with laughter away from me. I followed her, but very soon she vanished into the jungle and into the remoteness of silence. Naturally, I determined to pursue her. I could no longer live without her, and in the exquisite harmony of our two natures, I imagined wonderful creative potentialities. Let me explain briefly the method and experience of locomotion in this world. I found that, by reaching out a musical limb and knitting its extremity into the sound pattern of some fixed object at a distance, in either dimension or both, I obtained a purchase on the object and could draw my whole body toward it. I could then reach out another limb to a still farther point. Thus I was able to climb about the forest of sound with the speed and accuracy of a gibbon. Whenever I moved, in either dimension, I experienced my movement merely as a contrary movement of the world around me. Near objects became nearer, or less near. Remote objects became less remote, or slipped further into the distance and vanished. Similarly, my movement up or down the musical scale appeared to me as a deepening or heightening of the pitch of all other objects. In locomotion, I experienced no resistance from other objects save in the collision of dissonance, which I could generally avoid by altering my shape. I discovered that a certain degree of dissonance between myself and another offered only very slight resistance and no pain. Indeed, such contacts might be pleasurable, but harsh discords were a torture and could not be maintained. I soon found that there was a limit to my possible movement up and down the scale. At a point many octaves below my normal situation, I began to feel oppressed and sluggish. As I toiled downwards, my discomfort increased, until, in a sort of swoon, I floated up again to my native musical plane. Ascending far above this plane, I felt at first exhilaration, but after many octaves a sort of lightheadedness and vertigo overtook me, and presently I sank, reeling to the few octaves of my normal habitat. In the level dimension, there seemed to be no limit to my power of locomotion, and it was in this dimension chiefly that I sought the vanished nymph. I pressed forward through ever-changing tonal landscapes. Sometimes they opened out into level vistas of remote, dim musical objects, or into tonal vistas, deep and lofty, revealing hundreds of octaves above and below me. Sometimes the view narrowed by reason of the dense musical vegetation to a mere tunnel, no more than a couple of octaves in height. Only with difficulty could I work my way along such a passage. Sometimes, in order to avoid impenetrable objects, I had to clamber far into the treble or the bass. Sometimes, in empty regions, I had to leap from perch to perch. At last, I began to weary. Movement became repugnant, perception uncertain. Moreover, the very form of my body lost something of its pleasant fullness. Instinct now impelled me to an act which surprised my intellect, though I performed it without hesitation. Approaching certain luscious little musical objects, certain very simple but vigorous little enduring patterns of timbre and harmony, I devoured them. That is, I broke down the sound pattern of each one into simpler patterns, and these I incorporated into my own harmonious form. Then I passed on, refreshed. Presently I was confronted by a crowd of the intelligent beings tumbling helter-skelter toward me and jostling one another in their haste. Their emotional timbre expressed such fear and horror that my own musical form was infected with it. Hastily moving myself several octaves toward the bass to avoid their frantic course, which was mostly in the treble, I shouted to them to tell me what was the matter. As they fled past, I distinguished only a cry which might be translated, "The big bad wolf." My fear left me, for now I recognized that this was a flock of very young creatures. So I laughed reassuringly and asked if they had encountered the lovely being whom I was seeking, and I laughed to myself at the ease and sweetness with which her musical name came to me when I needed it. They answered only with an augmented scream of infantile grief as they faded into the distance. Disturbed, I pursued my journey. Presently I came into a great empty region where I could hear a very remote but ominous growl. I halted to listen to the thing more clearly. It was approaching. Its form emerged from the distance and was heard in detail. Soon I recognized it as no mere childish boogie, but a huge and ferocious brute. With lumbering motion in the base, its limbs propelled it at a surprising speed, its harsh tentacles of sound flickering hither and thither far up into the treble, nosed in search of prey. Realizing at last the fate that had probably befallen my dear companion, I turned sick with horror. My whole musical body trembled and wavered with faintness. Before I had decided what to do, the brute caught sight of me, or rather sound of me, and came pounding toward me with the roar and scream of a train or an approaching shell. I fled, but soon realizing that I was losing ground, I plunged into a thicket of chaotic sound which I heard ahead of me and well up in the treble. Adapting my musical form and color as best I could to the surrounding wilderness, I continued to climb. Thus I hoped both to conceal myself and escape from the reach of the creature's tentacles. Almost fainting from the altitude, I chose a perch, integrating my musical limbs with the pattern of the fixed objects in that locality. Thus anchored, I waited, motionless. The brute was now moving more slowly, nosing in search of me as it approached. Presently, it lay immediately below me, far down in the base. Its body was now all too clearly heard as a grim cacophony of growling and belching. Its strident tentacles moved beneath me like the waving tops of trees beneath a man clinging to a cliff face. Still searching, it passed on beneath me. Such was my relief that I lost consciousness for a moment and slipped several octaves down before I could recover myself. The movement revealed my position. The beast of prey returned and began clambering awkwardly toward me. Altitude soon checked its progress, but it reached me with one tentacle, one shrieking arpeggio. Desperately, I tried to withdraw myself farther into the treble, but the monster's limb knit itself into the sound pattern of my flesh. Frantically struggling, I was dragged down into the suffocating bass. There, fangs and talons of sound tore me agonizingly limb from limb. Then suddenly I woke in the concert hall to a great confusion of scraping chairs. The audience was making ready to leave. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.